Hey everybody, hope you're having a wonderful day. I want to have a quick chat with you about what I'm doing with this channel, as I believe that it will help explain the context of this video in relation to the other ones that I've already uploaded and will be uploading in the future. I have two primary intentions with this channel. The first is to challenge my ability to organize and articulate my understanding of these training concepts so that I can solidify my understanding in a way that makes it easier to convey to others what really matters in training. Which brings me to my second intention, and that is to start a conversation with the people that watch my videos that helps you understand the principles that differentiate effective training from ineffective training. I say that because I see far too many people who spin their wheels with fitness for years without making any real results, and it starts to become a rather vicious trap for the individual in particular. Because the individual has invested so much time into their fitness, they may start to become ashamed of the fact that they haven't gotten results that they expected to get from their hard efforts. But it is a fact of life that hard effort only counts if it is applied correctly. If you're a beginner, this could help you understand how you need to get started with things. And if you've been in the gym for a while but plateaued, these videos could help you start making those gains again. So far, I've spent some time explaining progressive overload in a couple ways to illustrate its importance and how your program should really be focused around making that happen over the long term. After that, we laid out some progression models based on manipulating both weight and reps, with the progression models in that video being what will be the best fit for the majority of people. Finally, right before today's video, we talked about the essence of your training, that being stimulus. In that video, I discussed how the quality of the stimulus you get from training is the most important variable and the hardest one to track coincidentally. And I gave you a couple points in that video to help maximize the quality of your stimulus. Now, after some pondering on where I wanted to take the conversation next, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about what the bones of every training plan you have ever run and are ever going to run is. These bones that I'm referring to are intensity, volume, and frequency, and every single training plan is just a variation of those three variables. It's a necessity to have all three of these present because if just one of those is missing, then there isn't a training plan. A training plan with zero frequency means you're training 0 times a week, in the same way that a training plan with zero volume means you're doing 0 work a week, and a training plan with zero intensity means that you're not stimulating the muscle at all. This idea I just laid out is quite intuitive, and I think to a lot of you, what I just said makes sense, but a lot of people fail to understand the dynamic that exists between those three variables. Today's video is going to serve as a definition of these three variables so that we are all on the same page during the discussion of some of the most common mistakes I see made with regards to each of those variables. At the end of the video, I'll provide some general guidelines to follow that will make for a quality training split. And in the next video, I'll be talking about the relationship between each of these variables a little more closely, as well as some tertiary variables that exist when you start to place an emphasis on some of these variables over others or in conjunction together. Today's discussion of these variables is going to be based on the assumption that this conversation is in regards to hypertrophy training, which just means muscle growth, bodybuilding. Although strength training also takes place in the weight room, we have to look at these variables a little differently in that context, so I'll be saving that discussion for another day. With that long preamble out of the way, let's get into today's topic. Now, I'm going to be discussing these variables by starting off with what I believe to be the least flexible and negotiable variable, and finish with the most flexible and negotiable variable, which starts us off with intensity. Now, in the conversation of lifting, there are two meanings of the word intensity. The first one is referred to absolute intensity, which is describing the weight you are using on the bar relative to your theoretical 1 rep max for whatever that movement may be. For lack of confusion, let's just refer to this concept as load. I believe that the guidelines for proper loading for hypertrophy are to be somewhere around 35 to 90% of your 1 rep max, but I don't put much stock into those numbers because it's a very impractical way of looking at load. How many of you happen to know your cable row and lateral raise 1 rep max? Yeah, me neither. The more practical way to answer the question of how much load should I be using is to look at the rep ranges. Whenever rep range gets prescribed for an exercise, it has already answered the question of how much load you need to use. The appropriate amount of load is what will land you within that rep range. Another consideration to be made for load and rep range selection is that it is more practical to perform certain exercises with a particular rep range. It has nothing to do with finding a magical or perfect number of reps to do. It's really just a matter of practicality. For example, a movement like the bench press will lend itself to a more practical application when trained in lower rep ranges. The cons of going much higher in reps is that the bench press, with it being a barbell free weight movement, has stability and balance demands that could be what becomes a limiting factor in the movement. It is also true that the pecs generally respond well to heavy loads, which the bench press allows us to do. So when it comes to load selection, it's really just a matter of finding both the right exercise and the right rep range for that exercise. Excuse me. Just had lunch. Now, the other definition of intensity is known as relative intensity, which is referring to the level of effort you are putting into a set regardless of the weight that is being used. Again, for the sake of simplicity, I would like to just refer to this as effort. The two mainstream ways of classifying how hard an effort was are RIR and RPE. RIR is an acronym for reps in reserve. If you did a set of 8 on curls and could have gotten 2 more reps if you kept going till failure, that is 2 reps in reserve, 2 RIR. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion and is basically the inverse of RIR. If you had 2 reps left in the tank, it was an RPE 8. Conversely, if you had 0 reps left in the tank, it's an RPE 10. Both methods are describing the same idea of how many reps we could have done but are keeping in the tank. They are just expressing it using different means. Within hypertrophy, we have quite a bit of flexibility with how much load we can use, but effort is not as negotiable. I don't read the literature much, so I could be wrong about this, but I believe the current theory behind what drives muscle growth is that it is the mechanical tension a muscle endures that causes growth. I personally don't bother thinking about this too much because there's a much simpler way of gauging what is the appropriate level of effort, and that is this. It's the reps that you really have to fight for that are going to grow you. By fight here, I'm saying that you not only put forth a lot of effort in simply making the weight move, but that you maintain a consistent quality of technique and control over the weight as you approach failure. If you are someone new to the gym or you're currently experiencing a plateau, I can say with a great amount of certainty that this is what you should be focusing on in your training. Effort is simply not negotiable in the muscle building game, which is why you see plenty of people who go to the gym 5 days a week for years and still not see results. They're checking some boxes, they're doing an appropriate quantity of work, but it's just not quality work with that high level of effort present. The training simply has to be hard if it is going to cause muscle growth. Now, the next training variable we're going to discuss is volume, which there are 2 ways, again, of classifying. We're going to start with the more practical definition as far as tracking volume is concerned, which is this. Volume is the number of sets you do for a muscle, where that muscle is what limits your performance in the set. This is predominantly looked at as total sets done within a week, with how many sets you do within a day being of a secondary importance, so long as you follow some general guidelines that we'll get to at the end of this video. The way that I like to think of the muscles in the body when I'm counting sets is primary, secondary, and tertiary muscles. And this is just what helps me organize volume. Primary muscles are the big ones like the pecs, quads, posterior chain, and back, which are the rate limiters in compound movements and need the most recovery demands, which dictates that we organize our training around those. Secondary muscles are the ones which will require isolations to maximize growth in, but they can still interfere with performance on our compounds if we are not considerate of recovery windows and fatigue interference. This will apply to muscles like the biceps, triceps, shoulders, and is true for all the aforementioned primary muscles when we isolate them. And that's something that makes sense intuitively, you can't really just spam chest flies because they're not a bench press and expect it not to interfere with any kind of other pressing you have going on within the week. Same is true for tricep isolation. Biceps are kind of iffy on that. Some people think it interferes with their back movements. Personally, I just save them for after back movements, but that's kind of the thought that's going on there. Now, tertiary muscles like the neck, calves, abs, and forearms are also going to need isolation work to maximize growth, but they can be put almost anywhere in your program without really interfering with anything else. I don't think you're ever really going to be able to do enough calf work to interfere with your deadlifts or your bench press. Same is true with your abs. Well, abs, there's probably some rules to abide by in terms of compound movements, especially lower body ones, but it's not as finicky as primary and secondary muscle training. Now, the second meaning of volume is known as workload or tonnage, which is calculated by taking the weight we are using times the number of sets and the number of reps we move the weight for. As an example, let's say that you are bench pressing 100 pounds for 3 sets of 10. Every set you move 100 pounds for 10 repetitions, which makes the workload, or the tonnage, of each set 1,000 pounds. With 3 total sets, the total workload for bench press that day is 3,000 pounds. This isn't a number you need to actively track. In fact, I encourage you to just track the sets per day and week in your training log. The concept of workload and tonnage is more so to help us take a look at our training to determine which of our training sessions are going to place a higher demand on our recovery and which ones will require less recovery. This allows us to arrange our training in a way where we can have these really heavy-duty sessions that give us a ton of stimulus in the gym, while still having the ability to include other training days in our week that won't detract from that primary session. By seeing this concept of workload, we can make informed decisions about which exercises to put on a given day, along with the amount of sets and reps we should be allocating to the task at hand. Framework that I have found beneficial for making this process intuitive in your own training is the heavy, light, medium system, but I'm going to save the discussion of that topic for another day. Now, I want to get to a common pitfall that I notice in others' training plans, and that is that there is simply way too much volume in the plan for it to be sustainable or to get results, really. And this usually manifests in 2 forms. In the first scenario, you have an absolute stud of a gym rat, a real Eric Bugenhagen, Rick Distick type, who knows what it means to train to failure, but that's really the only part they have figured out. That's not to make any kind of slights towards Rick Distick. You are one of my male power fantasies, good sir. Keep on Zercher deadlifting. But this type, they take the kitchen sink approach to training and just do an ungodly amount of volume with no days off. Eventually, the fatigue accumulated from training like this supersedes your recovery capabilities and manifests in the form of tendinitis, if you're lucky, or worse than that, an injury happens. The alternative reality that occurs from too much volume in a training plan happens when someone just does an arbitrarily high number of sets because they saw that someone with abs on Instagram just so happens to do that too. This commonly is getting referred to as junk volume, and junk volume is defined as the sets we are doing in the gym that aren't meaningfully making contributions to our hypertrophy goals. If not for blindly copycatting someone else's training, a logical fallacy that contributes to junk volume is to think that it's better to shoot for a little too much in training than too little. That way I can at least maximize the gains that I'm going to be making by making sure that I do the maximum work I can handle. The issue with this line of thinking is that our junk volume does still give us something despite that lack of meaningful stimulus, and that is fatigue. So by having such an arbitrarily high number of sets in your workouts, you're not only wasting your time with a good majority of your sets, but you're actively detracting from the value you were going to get out of the sets that were contributing meaningfully to our hypertrophy gains. Now, junk volume not only has an effect on the physical, but on the mental as well. With our own training, we need to treat every set very seriously if it's going to get us promising results. And with a training plan that has junk volume in it, we're setting ourselves up to sandbag our own training. Let me explain on that a little bit. Let's say you follow a program I saw shared by a fitness influencer a couple weeks ago, which has you doing 50 sets per body part per week. If you do the math, you can see pretty quickly that this guy is advising you, the person following the plan, to do 400 sets of volume a week. Can you seriously claim that you are able to give 400 maximum effort attempts every week and continue to progress on those efforts every following week? Or is it possibly a little more likely that in order to get through such a lofty task laid out in front of you, that you sandbag your earlier sets so that the later sets are even possible? Much like how a runner is going to start their 5K race with a jog because they know how tired they will get towards the end of it. A lot of people get fooled into thinking that training like this is productive because it still causes them to work up a good sweat and feel tired by the end of things. While their entire session is filled with way more than enough quantity, it simply lacks that quality effort that's required to see progression. You can add 0 to 0 50 times in a row, and the way that math checks out for me, it's still going to get you 0. I really do insist on starting things off on lower volume protocols, maximizing what you do with each set and only going up once your progress dictates that it is time to go up. It's going to set you up for a better relationship with your set so you can maintain that intensity, and it's going to give you a better gym life balance in general. This brings us to our final variable, frequency, which we are either going to be discussing one of two things generally. Every variable came in twos in this conversation. I didn't realize that till now. But the first is how often we are hitting a certain muscle within a week, and the second is going to be how many days we are lifting weights within a week. Now, up to this point, I've discussed things that are pretty set in stone in regards to training. It's pretty much non-negotiable that you train hard and that you do neither too little nor too much of that work to grow, so you're somewhere in the middle of the bell-shaped curve on that volume. Yet frequency is a variable that is going to dictate what your training actually looks like in your training life, and that is because it is the most flexible out of the three. When you are trying to decide how often you want to train a muscle group in a given week, you're going to have to be aware that this will also answer the question of how many sets you will have to be doing in each session. You can also look at it from the other perspective of asking yourself how many sets you are going to do in a day and determining your frequency based on that. It's important to look at the matter both ways because you need your training to be practical from both a top-down perspective and everything that goes on in the week and what each individual session contains. Most of you who are watching are pursuing lifting as a hobby, and it's important that we craft a plan that makes this hobby mesh well with the rest of our life. Otherwise, we set ourselves up with a training plan that was never really realistic to begin with, and therefore gets us no results. Since we are in the pursuit of developing the entire of the body, the way that we're going to decide to organize our sessions as a checklist for hitting select muscle groups on given days could be what sets us up for success or failure in the long run. Now, this next idea I'm going to be talking about I got from Sam Shethar, so I can't claim originality on this one, but I found that it's a really cool way of understanding how much work you should be doing in a given day. The concept itself is called tasks per session, and it's just a way for us to check our training and be honest when we ask ourselves, are we doing too much work in a given day? The way I like to define a task is, again, in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary muscles. Since I'm usually going to be starting a session with compound lifts to hit the primary muscles, I categorize each movement pattern as its own task. So, if I were to do pull-ups and a lat pull-down, I would categorize both those exercises as just one task. But if I were to do pull-ups and an RDL, I would categorize that as two tasks because we are now taxing a different set of very large muscles on the body that will have an additional set of big recovery demands. In that first example, I was doing a pull-up and a lat pull-down. Those are both vertical pulls. We're hitting the exact same muscles twice with those two exercises. But in the latter example, I was talking about pull-ups and an RDL. The first exercise, we're doing a vertical pull, so we're working a lot of the upper back in that one. But then we go to an RDL, which is now taxing the hamstring, the glutes, the lower back, and we're getting a splash effect on the upper back. But it's really the new muscles that were introduced with that next compound exercise that is introducing this additional recovery demand that's going to take consideration. You can't really go ahead and do hinges again the next day when you just did RDLs if they were at a appropriate level of effort to cause a stimulus. That's going to come with recovery demands. That's just the name of the game. I lost my spot. Give me a second. Okay, here we are. Now, since I usually train secondary muscles with isolations and I can superset those pretty easily, I'll pull together like 2 to 3 body parts for the isolation section as one task because that is roughly, it's not exact science, but that's roughly the same amount of fatigue as one of those compound movements done correctly. Finally, for those tertiary muscles I had mentioned earlier, I could be hitting all of them in a single day, and I would categorize that as a single task because the fatigue generated from these just is not as high. It just really isn't. I can knock out a circuit of neck extensions, forearm curls, hanging leg raises, and calf raises, all of those taken to failure, and it would still not be as tiring as just one set of RDLs taken near failure, let alone to failure. So, that is my main consideration when defining a task. how much fatigue is going to be generated when I do it. Now, you will find that if you're going to the gym 6 or 7 days a week, you don't have to consolidate as many tasks into a single session because you have the liberty of spreading that out throughout your training week. If you're someone like me who likes to train 4 or 5 days a week, you have to take on more tasks in a given session if you want to do everything on your body justice. But I find that this is actually what works better for me because it is what fits my personality the best. I like having days off from the gym and then absolutely annihilating myself when I do show up. I personally have never been one of those guys who likes working out every single day, and that's fine. There's nothing that really says that you have to. So, now that we've defined all these variables and had the time to talk about each one of them conceptually and with the biggest considerations and downfalls of each one, I want to share with you the general recommendations that will fit the vast majority of you the best. As far as effort goes, you should strive to push your compound movements 1 to 3 reps shy of failure while pushing your isolation exercises 0 to 2 reps away from failure. With compound movements, you run the risk of altering your technique too much if you try to hit failure, which comes with a higher risk of injury. Plus, with the higher amount of stimulus you're getting from that movement anyways, you will still be getting productive training in at the 1 to 3 reps in reserve range. With isolation exercises, you're generally going to be safer when pushing these to failure, and with the lower amount of sheer stimulus you're provided from the movement, you're going to be better off going straight for 0 reps in reserve most of the time. In regards to volume, a good range to fall within is somewhere between 8 to 16 sets per muscle per week. I personally am going to advise that you start at the lower end of this range and to then maximize what you get out of those sets, only going up in number as it is a necessity for you to continue making progress. Your psychological ability to give a set everything you have with good form is a skill that needs to be trained, which even then is still going to have a limit to it. Please do not fall for the volume trap and instead focus on maximizing the quality of your sets before you go for increasing quantity. Until you start to become more experienced with training, just stay within those ranges. The guys you see work above or below this range are doing it because it is an answer to a problem that has arisen in their own training, or by manipulating the other variables of intensity and frequency in order to allow for volume to be higher. The approach they are currently following most likely was not their starting point, and it may not work for you at all, so just focus on yourself and do not blindly follow the training choices of others. In regards to frequency, the general recommendation is to hit a muscle group 2 to 3 times a week. This is in line with what you've probably heard already about recovery windows needing to be 48 to 72 hours depending on how hard the muscle was trained last time. Truth be told, you don't have to abide by those windows, and the human body can adapt to hitting a muscle group daily if the programming is intelligent enough to allow that. In truth, you don't have to abide by the window. I guess I wrote that line twice. I did. That's my bad. Next line. It's not like the calisthenics bros see no back growth just because they do pull-ups every single day. You get what I'm saying there? It's rather because of the practicality of its application that this advice is so solid and sound. If we are to train a muscle hard enough with sufficient volume and need to do the same for all the other muscles we are training and need to feel fresh or at least ready to train that muscle again with enough volume and effort to stimulate growth again, it seems that we need about a day or two in between to make that happen. In response to the question, how many days a week should I lift? The response is that anything from 2 to 7 days a week is going to be fair game. I personally would advise anywhere from 3 to 5 days a week, but what choice is the best fit for you will boil down to your personality. Do you like long 2 to 3 hour training sessions a few times a week? Or do you prefer 1 hour sessions 6 days a week? It will also depend upon your life stressors. If you're a single mother working a full-time job and going to med school, I'm not going to recommend you go to the gym 6 days a week like I would a college student. Finally, I think the other big consideration is just what your goals are. If you aren't in this to maximize your gains but are more interested in just rounding out your development for another sport, 2 to 3 days a week is going to be a perfectly valid choice with everything else you're doing in your training already. You don't have to be that guy that carries the boats. Now, for the conclusion to this conversation today, the exact training split you decide to go with doesn't matter as much as simply buying into the one you choose and staying the course and trusting the process. The training split is just a way of distributing the workload in a week, hopefully done so with the intention of maximizing the stimulus we get from each task we pursue in the gym. You're going to find that a lot of common splits fit the bill for the general guidelines I listed earlier. An upper-lower, 4 or 6 times a week, a push-pull legs, a full body, the gentleman split, the Arnold split, and splits like chest and buys, back and tries, shoulders and legs, all work here. The best split to pick is going to be the one that allows you to commit to the training consistently. And there are many things that matter far more than the training split that we've already discussed. Progressive overload, pushing effort and exercises with quality and technique, having a balanced approach to the gym that allows you to be consistent matters far more than finding the perfect split that you are going to be inconsistent with. So that wraps up the conversation for today. I know it was mostly just more conceptual, mindset-focused ways of looking at training, but I just wanted to lay out what the actual bones of training are before we started looking at actual training splits or the relationship between intensity, frequency, and volume. I feel like this will serve as a nice talking point, what was I trying to say? So it'll serve as a nice framework for the next few videos. So I wanted to go ahead and get this one out of the way before I start working on the next ones. But if you have any questions about what was discussed today, if you think that I could have explained something a little better, or if you have recommendations on what you want to hear me talk about next, please let me know. But other than that, guys, y'all have a good one.